well known, but everyone here knows Venky at least as well as I do, I think. So he truly is someone who doesn't need any introduction here or elsewhere. So it's a really interesting talk, which we've lost, but the book, if you haven't gotten the book yet, I highly recommend it. It's a very thoughtful book. We'll hear more about it today, but he has, as you know, knowing Venky, strong opinions about how research should be done and cultivated. And it's really well articulated. Book. So without further ado,
Okay. And then
Well, thank you very much, John. You know, John, I got to know him, even though he also worked at Bell Labs, but he was, I discovered, quite a bit younger than me. And he was at Homedale and I was at Murray Hill. And I got to know him after I came here to Santa Barbara. And we discovered, and we became, if you like, real good partners in entrepreneurs, in fostering entrepreneurship at Santa Barbara. And so John and I became really close friends. So John, thank you very much for being such a wonderful host. Many people ask me, do we miss Santa Barbara? I said, today is like homecoming for me. You should do like me, when you get to a certain age, you think about your past, all the places you have been, and all the great people you have worked with. So the two books which I wrote, which you mentioned, this recent book, first I had it 4 years ago, which really has a chapter on UCSB, and I spoke at the Technology Management Program here 3 years ago on this. And this is very recent, just this past year. It is really kind of both my personal aspects, but really being humbled with what others have done. So I think it is really in that sense, partly history, partly my personal experiences, and partly how I benefited. And clearly UCSB was one of the places I have a great deal of affection, despite having deserted you and gone to Harvard. And I used to have a view graph at Harvard that leaving sunny Santa Barbara and coming to cold, wintry Boston, and what that happened. And you should know, when I went there in 1998, in 2000, Herb Kromer and Alan Hager won Nobel Prize. And I'd already predicted to Chancellor Yang that Kromer might win it. I had a message from a colleague here who's nameless. He said, you left us, you should be here, UCSB 2, Harvard 0. So I'm here coming with my utmost humility, but I still want to actually remember my past. And the next view graph, is the left-hand side is what Evelyn Hu gave to me. She was the director of the Center for Quantized Electron Structures. And for those students in this room, if you want to see how the young John Bowers look like, he's up there. If you want to see how Steve Denbars looked there, he's right there. But the people so I could not believe that's 25 years since I left UCSB. So, you know, there used to be a joke that so many people from Bell Labs came to UCSB, and they said UCSB is Bell Labs West. But UCSB got so good, and Bell Labs went down the hill. They said Bell Labs is UCSB East. So I thought I would set this rule correctly. Evelyn had at the bottom of that slide, by the way, this slide, you know, you always put the things you cherish in your office. This particular thing is beautiful framed picture, which Evelyn gave me. And the bottom of it said, elephants never forget their friends. You might not always say. So for me, I will never forget how special this was. I want to mention a couple of other things. It's good to see Marshall Gossett here. I started my career at Bell Labs in 1968. And I joined a department of Stan Geschwind. It was called Quantum Physics Research Department. And guess, there were two future UCSB faculty members who were already there. Art Gossett had joined 2 years before me, and Jim Allen had just joined as a postdoc there. So all three of us started in the same department. And I have a special regard for Art for many reasons. He and I were in the same department. He was 2 years ahead of me. People may not know, Art got his degree from Berkeley in physical chemistry. He is a Harvard undergraduate and was recruited to Bell Labs to study nuclear magnetic resonance. And that's what he was doing while I was a member of that same department. And about 6, 8 years later, I was still not in management, but Art and I were good friends. And Art says, Venky, I'm thinking of changing fields and going into molecular beam epitaxy. Obviously, I discussed it with who the managers were. And what did I know? I said, it'd be a good thing to do. Maybe why it's always a good thing to do something new. But it really is history. It shows not only the courage of the man, because we're doing something very different, and then you'll be resoundingly successful at it. And that was the essence of Bell Labs, in fact. Art, you talk about UCSB was special. Bell Labs always had an open door policy. But Art's lab was much more than an open door. It really was a welcoming place where people met and congregated. And in fact, he could read, even though materials growth was far from his upbringing, that he began to mentor the right technical support, deal with the physicists, and deal with the device people, both of whom which he could communicate with. He became a magnet for various things. And I believe that was true at UCSB. So we unfortunately lost him this past year, but I want to acknowledge how important a person and who epitomized the culture which I want to talk about. Second, you might not know, actually, I was thinking back on this. Art and I had one other connection. I always, even when I was vice president of Sandia, went to March meeting where the physicists and material scientists would gather. So in 1991, March meeting, I see Art attending the same meeting. Then he mumbled to me, UCSB is looking as for a deal. I didn't know what he was talking about, but he obviously came and whispered it into people's ears here. And pretty soon I had a call to come and visit here. So I owe Art, in some way, that kind of deep connection. The other person I want to mention here, who also we lost this past year, Jim Allen, by the way, is there, smiling face right there, is actually Jim Merz. Jim Merz was slightly different from Art and me in the sense he was already a member of the semiconductor department, which I headed. That's when I became, if you like, Jim Merz, a supervisor. And he came to me, well, Santa Barbara is recruiting, and he had enough confidence that even though he was telling his department head, I said I would write a letter in support and everything else. I remember writing to Herb Kromer, and he ended up coming here, and we lost Jim Merz this past year. And so he also became a very good personal friend, and in fact, vacationed in Cape Cod, and we attended his wake in the Cape. So we lost two of our illustrious members who brought many aspects of UCSB together. I think also to mention one other thing. Even though I talk about Bell Labs, actually, there were many industrial labs, and Bell Labs is just the iconic name. There was IBM, Exxon, Hughes Aircraft, Rockwell, a whole culture where you were really just not wondering, is it physics or engineering? Let's just solve one of the most exciting problems and work what might be the future. And that's what I'm talking about with Bell Labs as an icon. So I've been reflecting on this ever since I gave up my old lab about 10 years ago when I stepped down as dean and started wanting to influence education and the introduction of technology in society. I became director of the Science, Technology, and Public Policy program at the Harvard Kennedy School, and I learned people who actually controlled all of us, the politicians and the economists. So and believe me, I can give lectures, and my boss was Larry Summers, a famous economist. So and people keep wanting to show that they want to recreate Bell Labs. They don't have a clue how that is to be done. Lots of people, because it's like we have another Harvard or another, and so on. So I started looking at it and working on it and teaching. So I want to really do is really ask how to create great research organizations. And we know UCSB, we reached national problems with 6, 7 Nobel Prizes. Is a good example of it in one of the chapters in my book. And I really wanted to articulate 2 points. One, I grew up in physics, but for me, physics was all of it. That is, you actually learn by doing, you get your hands dirty. It's not just the engineers who are the technicians. They are really, physics is such that both science and applications, so-called basic research and applied research, literally Bell. That was in fact the ethos of Bell Labs. So there is no cultural divide. That's really important. It's been an open door. The theorists were not sitting in some ivory tower. They were working next to that with the people doing the real work. So in fact, Art Gossack's lab had very good technical support with Billy Whitman first, and then John English was here, and they were viewed as your fellow. You should know, I'll have another biograph. When they discovered the world leading mobility in Art Gosser's lab, I said, if you beat IBM's record, I will wear a chauffeur cap and take you for dinner. That's actually true. Art is not here to verify, but Martha should have been there. So I want to say that you really want to conquer this divide. So we call it a new word, technoscientific, where technology and science merge with each other. That's the main message I want to give. And the second main point, it is consistent and it is a deeply holistic, deeply integrated. In a time when we talk about diversity and all, that is so important. And you must also remember one other thing. It's still a deeply human endeavor. When we talk about great leadership, it is the human part which is paramount. And there's always a paramount in Bell Lab. This is what I learned when I read the speech of the vice president of Bell Labs when the transistor was invented. He never talked about the equipment and all the other facilities. He talked about the people. And he said, I can burn down this lab, but I can't recreate the people. And that is the most important essence of this talk. So it is also about nurturing people. So I feel I made a mistake when I said to John Bowers, created the Center for Entrepreneurial Engineering Management. Management is not quite the right word. It is creating new kind of leaders who actually will know how to nurture it. That's why it is difficult for standard business school. John, I hope you would agree with me. So this is the essence of my talk. And I want to just say a few other words. The reason I felt nationally, I've made my life in America. I have 7 grandchildren, all getting degrees right here. And US leadership in science and engineering is under some attack and question. There have been many national reports written, rising over the gathering storm, rising up and category 5, the perils of complacency. I was actually a member of the American Academy panel on this, which really said we had forgotten how to do great research. I already realized, if you look at my own field, that in fact, many of the papers in applied physics later than were no longer coming from the industrial labs, but they were coming from elsewhere, from China and others. So we did an analysis. And if you look at the keen competition, and you should know China is an extremely important country. We have political differences right now. This is not to degrade China anymore. They're doing some great stuff. Our schools of engineering have 2 primary populations, Chinese and Indians, as you all know. Not surprising, they're the 2 biggest populations in the world. That China's role in publications, and more important, the quality of the publications, if you take the top 1%, is now in good competition with us. You look at John Bowers' field or think of quantum computing or some of those areas, you know they're doing frontline work. And I visited them many times. And I go to those labs, and actually tears would come to my eyes, because that's what I experienced when I was a young student at their labs. They were funding this communist country, people which I'd never seen in America. We had to go beg for money. They didn't have to beg for money in this case. There's some important points here. So there is a real awakening in our country in this. And that's why in that biograph, I had a companion biograph on the Chips and Science Act. I wrote 2 papers in Issue Scientific last year, one before the act came into being and one after, because the jury is still out. So this is America Competes Act, which Congress started debating in 2021. In 2022, I wrote a paper in Issues and Technology trying to unify these 2. And I can't say I'm the only one, there are lots of people working on it. And in fact, the Chip and Science Act was articulated in 2022 August, where it was signed into law and said, you know what happened? Semiconductors, the transistor invented at Bell Labs 75 or 80 years ago, is the heartbeat of every computer, everything in this room. It is the oil. It is as essential. Every AI computer uses thousands, millions of transistors, and they are so critical. We, who used to be the manufacturing hub, United States, took much of technology to Europe and were the manufacturing hub. Americans got their hands dirty and got things to work and seem to have forgotten and elevated some aspects improperly. Where the economists said, oh, we'll get the cheap labor in China or somewhere else, but that was a horrible mistake. I'm emotional about it because Bell Labs was destroyed when they separated the manufacturing from the customer. And I knew I was offered a position at Bellcore. I said, I will not go there because I knew there was no manufacturing. I said, how will they sustain themselves? And Bellcore got disbanded and the Bell Lab became a skeleton force. I was lucky that that was Sandia Labs and UCSB found wisdom that I just was lucky because I could have become a boiled frog because Bell Labs and all of them, and many people were hurt. So I think this Chips and Science Act, so at that time already I had written how important it is to have manufacturing. Bell Labs, this icon of research, actually always knew it was must be connected to the communications business. But they also realized that this is technology that has to be long-term, and sometimes the science will be important, sometimes the technology, and you just must nurture that with the right people. So you still have a very far-out goal. It is who we want to go to as a country. It's like President Kennedy saying we want to go to the moon. Not because it is hard, because it defines us as a people. That's the kind of mentality which you had. And you know, that picture which I showed of Bell Labs was actually a picture of Alexander Graham Bell, the founder, who was my God. Because every person I recruited, I took them to that bust and would say, go off the beaten track, delve into the woods, you'll find something which you've never seen before. And every person who was involved in recruiting, I would take them there. I said, this is the institution you're coming to. That's where Ab Carson was, when Jim Burrs was there, when George Powers was there, and like people like Glenn Fredrickson and so on, which actually still makes me get some goosebumps. And he still was the iconic, who also cared about idealistic. He created the microphone because he wanted to convert electricity into sound because his mother was deaf. His mother was deaf. He cared for his mother, and that was one of the defining. It was different from Edison, who was more money-minded, but Edison was more of an idealist. So you should know I'm passionate about this, but I've read the history books a lot, and it's been driving me a lot. So this is what is important, is we created the National Science Foundation authorization, where they for the first time created a technology directorate. You don't know how much it meant to me personally, because I feel I've been a lonely voice in this along with a few others. And I think finally the country has woken up because of the competition, global competition. I wrote articles, as you know, we had a lot of issues with the Chinese telecommunications company. Those who know telecommunications, there's a company called Huawei. Huawei manufacture all the networking technology for 5G and other things. And they were literally cornering the whole market. And that's no fault of theirs. AT&T and Western Electric, which is to manufacture those things, of course, stopped all of it. Nortel disappeared from the scene, and the stuff with John Bowles would know a lot more than I do. And that is why we had no more. And communications is so central to national security. Information is what university is about. You cannot give that to anybody else. So that was a serious consequence, which caused all kinds of bureaucracy. It's not Chinese fault. If Huawei is a perfectly good company, if there was some kind of war, they will have to report to the Chinese government. Just like with AT&T, I have to report to the American government. That's just the way it is. So you've got to understand this and not just say, oh, we'll do the cheap work there and we'll just do this here. So that's really quite. So this, I believe, is the most important thing President Biden has done. Once again, reawakening the United States to manufacturing and then including the science and technology. So it's really important. We don't know. History is still out. We can still mess it up because they are on the communist people run very efficiently. But I think at least it's a step in the right direction. So, and there's lots happening in this. I've written several articles. I won't talk more about it, but I think it's an important thing for this audience to watch about. It really is important. And we still don't know. There will be budget fights. So then money will be taken away and we don't know what all will happen. But at least there's a real awakening on two things in the current administration: the role of manufacturing and still the importance of science and research. And second, the fact that climate is a serious issue and that we must develop various technologies, batteries, and all these other features, which are not under DOE gets a fair amount of money in this. So what the Institute for Energy Efficiency is doing ultimately would depend on this. So it's important. This really is important. I was telling Leah Stokes, environment is important, but the energy technology is going to be key because you cannot do economic development without energy. So the environmental thing is just whistling in the wind. Are you going to starve the people, or are you going to? So there's some very, very fundamental issues of how environment should be handled. So that sort of, so this has led to this started. The chip war is a book written. I told my friend John that he should really read it as part of the whole semiconductor history and why Intel lost its shirt. Those are great companies with Bob Noyce, Gordon Moore, Grove, literally the icons. And then they appointed a finance person in charge. The people, instead of working engineers, came in t-shirts and came in white shirts and ties. And he wrote this book, this historian, and almost destroyed Google, Intel, one of the great semiconductor companies. Just read chip war. So the others now are afraid. There is a Taiwan Semiconductor Act, South Korea, Europe. Everyone has realized this is going to be a global competition, like it or not. So it is quite important that we begin to really understand how to create the future. So now I'll go back to really the essence of this book, a little bit of the previous. I have one signed copy of each book, John. And what I would like you to do, just do a lottery for the students, especially those who work in technology, and they each get one. Okay. Would you do that for me?
Sure.
So the students will remember it, and that would be a good thing. I know you in a way and have it. So I wish I could bring many more, because I want the students to learn about this, and that's really quite important. And I really think so. Including history of UCSB is there from my perspective. You may not agree, but I think hopefully you will. At least get a feeling. So Vannevar Bush, after World War II, wrote the famous paper which did like Science, the Endless Frontier. They assumed everything was just science and physics by all the paramount. It was a view which was okay at that time. Vannevar Bush himself was an engineer. He was dean of engineering at MIT and built computers and so on. But the way the system was, the same thing which Harvard suffered, a certain British arrogance against engineering, that they just called science the endless frontier, and National Science Foundation, with no mention of engineering or technology and all the other things. And that is the pacemaker. It was realized about 20 years later by a man called Donald Stokes, who was dean at Princeton, that that was a fallacious argument. That science and technology often feed on each other. We all know the laws of thermodynamics. The chemical engineers are sitting in front of me. That the laws of thermodynamics happened after the steam engine, because you want to make a better steam engine. So you sometimes have to know what kind of sequence it occurs. And that technology was often the pacemaker of scientific progress. They actually, sometimes the science benefits, and myself and a postdoc with me, Tolu Mosu, showed this in a very detailed way with lots of examples of information technology, how that process actually works. That is, how science and technology mutually benefit each other and actually advance the frontier. And that was the essence of Bell Labs, actually. So I got another collaborator. I noticed my good friend Hua Li, former chair of ECE department, is here. His cousin, or Jeff Sao, who is a senior scientist at Sandia Laboratories, wanted to collaborate with me, and I'd organize a workshop. And we had many arguments, and suddenly we realized there was more deeply to go into the intellectual nature of the process. So I want to spend a few minutes about the nature of research and how exactly these things work. So, there's core reflections in the book. First of all, the first point you might notice is S stands for science, T stands for technology. But those of you who know some mathematics will find there is a dot on top of S and a dot on top of T. What that says is science and technology are not static, and research is not synonymous with science. It is some kind of admixture of S dot and T dot. That's really important. They're not, this is really the essence of it. Research is not to be conflated with science alone. That's the point. And the advanced, we'll come back to this in a little more detail. Second, too often. I wrote a proposal to the Soul Foundation, which I'm still grateful for, and the energy, the more of social science proposal. I had to wrote, what hypothesis do I have? How do you test the hypothesis, etc. That is okay, but it's a very limited view. Those who want to look for new hypotheses, who want to look for new questions, would never be funded. In today's, Darwin would not be funded, Einstein would not be funded, because they were going before. So this is, Bell Lab would do it. I'll show that example and work with Gossett and Stormer did. Third, question finding is as important as finding the answers. So identifying what the right problem is almost more important than even the solution. So we have the second language. We all know questions and answers, but how the cycle actually works. Third, both science and engineering go through periods of progress, steady progress, which is important, which I would call development. You've got some major idea, then you improve it a little more, and then suddenly something new happens. So it really is analogous to biology. It is punctuated equilibrium. There's a period of study, and suddenly that's what happens even in the development side. So that has to be understood. And you've got to do both the consolidation part. So development is important, but it is different. And development is not to be confused only with technology. People have often thought, oh, once you're doing development, you're doing technology. That is wrong. There's scientific development and there's technology development. And you've got to decide what you're doing. Sometimes science is the service of engineering, and sometimes engineering is the service of science. You just have to change your thinking. We talk about diversity and equality. This is it. So we want to, this is what Bell Labs was about. And I will show you with this very personal example why this is so. And ultimately, we want to go beyond this. Today, we're in the age of AI. We've got to ask a question. This is the human intelligence we talk about. We talk about Einstein or Edison or Graham Bell, all the great inventors. They're obviously people who could see far beyond any of us mortals could see. And how do we actually enhance human intelligence with AI? That is, I think, the next frontier. And that will be the next Bell Labs in new form of Google, new form of John Bowers and Ted Fredrickson and Brad Chimelka and everybody else, which will be the future. And our universities and the organizations must be created that. So that's the essence. And I will spend a little bit of time on what we now call not the scientific method, but the technoscientific method. So science, we talk about as facts and explanations, right? That's what theories are. But sometimes people think of facts as outside science and it's the explanations. We really view facts and explanations together with science. Engineering is the process of advancing technology, but technology can have certain forms. You don't know what form to build, and then you have to a certain function, some function that you want to have, and then you're going to build the right form, so it's forms and functions. So what happens is you've got to, so these are determined by either question finding, fact finding, and same with form finding. In technology, you want to find the form and then the function. Okay, so that is brings it a unified way, and you find the facts of science often with technology. And so that technology feeds into the science, and that leads to explanation. And then the next phase in science is generalizing, because if it works in this, it will work with something else. The same thing happens in technology. What we call biology is called exacting. My Harvard colleague, Gould, Stephen Jay Gould, wrote a famous paper in biology how dinosaurs suddenly acquired feathers and became birds. Essentially, the things demanded and exacted. So what would happen in technology? You should know the most famous examples. Radar was invented for with klystrons and magnetrons for microwave reflection and to know. And it was, of course, very important for defense. And a Raytheon engineer had a chocolate bar in his pocket and looking at some klystrons work, and suddenly he found his chocolate was melting. Then he realized that microwave ovens could be made. Vastly different, completely radar technology and magnetrons more closer to this man's field. And this happened in here. Jeff Sau and I have written a very detailed paper for research policy. If you let, when Bell Labs created the transistor, they created for communication. The idea was that you had made amplifiers with solid big tubes, which would break and you have to have long distance communication. The amplifier would burn. So they want to build something reliable and a good amplifier, and it was meant to be a communications amplifier. They didn't think of computing. And actually, it's now obvious to us the computing became more important. In fact, the communications thing was exapted into computing. One doesn't realize it. And now Mr. Jobs brought in more practically in this, where the biggest hit was computing. That's what exacting is about. It is called a spillover or generalizing, depending on how you view it. But you've got to view this in a uniform, in a unified way. Engineering is usually much more verb. So here, if you look at it, the nouns S and T are symmetric processes of knowledge. There is technological knowledge and there's scientific knowledge. The verbs science, S dot and T dot, as estimate for which S and T dynamically evolve. And then most importantly, S dot and T dot and S and T deeply interacting, feeding on each other in cycles you mentioned. And again, R is not synonymous with S. D is not synonymous with D. And that has been the fundamental problem in the thinking of people. That was not Bell Lab, that was not IBM, that was not hundreds of other places, including great other laboratories. So we created this false dichotomy, and which needs to be broken. So this is, you should know, I'm so passionate about it, and now some people are beginning to listen. It's been a struggle. Oh, Bell Labs was there, it was funded like this. They didn't realize how people had actually created this, and I understood this. So I want to spend a few minutes, and then we can open to some questions on a couple of points. It's really this issue of solutions. So often engineers do the solutions. This question finding is really important. That's what Bell Labs taught me. When I looked at the literature, one of the great leaders of Bell Labs was called Mervyn Kelly. And he would say, when you call a person for recruitment, don't just find out whether they know enough physics, chemistry, engineering, whatever they're working in. They've been to a good school, they know basically what it is. You've got to look as to how they think, how they question things. That is, ask not what you know, ask what you don't know. That's what the imagination is about. So the emphasis was on novelty, on creativity, and obviously you get one call, that doesn't mean it's always right. But that was the thing. You always, if you look at this. And so the question, and you know, in today's world, DARPA is a very successful organization, and many of us have gotten funding from DARPA, but still is a narrow way. If you did something which would be in science, it would be very hard to fund it through DARPA. It would be very hard to fund it. And in fact, moderation doping, what Gossard and Storm take is an example of that. And in fact, technology advanced in this way. And as Einstein said, the formulation of problems is often more essential than solution, really to raise new questions, new regard all questions on new angle requires creative marks for real progress. And that is the essence why Bell Lab won 11 Nobel Prizes, or even IBM won 5, and so on, because there was a culture which encouraged that. Second, I want to, one other man. I come from physics, and for a long time, particle physics, high energy physics, nuclear physics ruled the world. Physicists believed in reductionism. They believed you would have some fundamental laws, and you could do everything from those fundamental laws. My colleague, far more brilliant than almost anybody in this room, Phil Anderson, had the opposite view. He wrote a famous paper in Science, which was that is fundamentally wrong. More is different. When you have a complicated system, you cannot start with some of the fundamental laws and actually predict its behavior. Entirely new fields emerge. It's like saying chemistry is applied physics or something, biology is applied chemistry. It's just nonsense. Entirely new things happen, new ways of thinking, which you cannot get from those fundamental laws. So I learned this in this beautiful paper written by Phil Anderson, and really try to really go through this whole issue in great detail in the book. It's really important. That's why complexity has its own and requires all kinds of creative imagination to understand the new phenomena themselves. So I want to show this picture again, because this is close, near and dear to my heart. One of the things, those who are in semiconductors, this picture, I just found them in the internet. I have other pictures, horse, this is Horst Stormer, and his picture is also next to Bell's statue. Okay, I found this nice picture of art in his MBE lab, and then I found this nice picture of my other friend Dan Sui, who typically had this shirt like this and that's the way he used to be. So these three are my co-conspirators in arms. My only job was I happened to be the lucky director of that laboratory. You should know that when Horst Stormer was hired as a postdoc, we had just learned that we could make layered semiconductors good enough. People are already studying optical problems, the kind of stuff John and many others do, but it could be useful for transport. The material was good enough. So Stormer started measuring these samples prepared in Odd Gosford's lab. And one day he comes to me, you know, if you separate how you dope the material, it'll change the mobility. In fact, going to again, running to my boss, who told me, I said, Stormer has done something, and Gosford has something really interesting. And he says, what do they do? I said, the mobility is 20,000. He said, what's the best mobility? I said, it's a new principle. So they kept working on it. And when I left Bell Labs in 1987, to go as vice president of Sandia, there was a farewell luncheon for me. Horst Stormer gave one of the talks on behalf of 4 individuals: Art, Dan Sui, and John English, who's here, who's not here, but who's here, Art's assistant. I didn't have a picture of him, but I do want to acknowledge him as well, because the mobility over a period of time increased from 20,000 to 1 million, which means it was much more conducting the material. And at that time, we were in competition with IBM. I told John and Art, if you get mobility better than IBM, I will go and take you and Horst and John with a chauffeur-driven cab for dinner. And I kept my promise. I wish I could find that picture with me with a chauffeur hat, because they actually did it. But what was more important, this kludge of a sample with all kinds of wire denting, when Stormer and Sui measured it, it displayed with that high mobility, unusual behavior. All kinds of facts. With particle physicists spent millions and billions of dollars, they found it in this kludge of a sample prepared by NBE and with friends. So, and he was hired to do transport and make transistors, because his high mobility make high electron mobility transistors. Go talk to Umesh Mishra about them. They are everywhere. But that's not Horst Stormer studied afterwards. Didn't say you got to do that, or Dan Sui. Even my bosses recognized. I told Kumar Patel and Arno Penzias, who was not exactly the easiest boss, I said, no, we should encourage them to do the physics side. They discovered the fractional quantum Hall effect, and they all three shared the Oliver Buckley Prize, which is one of the most prestigious prizes, because that's something we had some input on. I remember still discussing it, how important that triad of Art, Stormer, and Sui were. So I said this before, and in the joke, I was always called Lord Venky, so Horst was always pulling my thing. This is not about me, it is about that thing. I want to make that absolutely clear. And that I also want the support of others, because my bosses also recognize, hey, don't go to make the transistors, which is important to Bell Labs. The science is also important. So both are important. And you make a judgment, what is important? And others still work on the transistor. So that's the message. So I actually put this in more detail. If you're an aficionado, actually, I put the engineering. Al Cho was one of the early inventors of molecular beam epitaxy. And literally we know this is what Art and Storm and Sui will make for flower. And perfected it. So it came from like an engineering mindset to grow materials in a controlled way, instead of just by heat, peace, and hope. And it led to revolutionary science and to revolutionary engineering, because new transistors came into being. This is exactly how the original transistor was born. And this is really back to the point. History repeats itself, and really important things can happen both in technology. And there's a period of standard engineering, which is important, a period of normal science. People are still working on it, and that's important, not to degrade that. But we know how that happened. I'm probably not entirely objective, because I was very close to it and very fond of those individuals, but I believe there is a good deal of truth in it. Others recognize it, not just me. So the thing which I was saying, John, research has to be nurtured, not managed. It's a really important thing. Really, your job is to make that organization successful. It is not about the manager. It is about making that process succeed. And in fact, this Ralph Bohr, he was the vice president of Bell Labs, and I had this undergraduate physics student who was my TA, a teaching fellow. I said, will you go, Bell Labs library still exists, and find the speeches of the original vice president who was the, and he gave many speeches how the transistor was born. And he said, people would, I said, you can burn down Bell Labs. He said, I can just recreate that. But if I don't have those people, I will never succeed. And so the most important aspect, he said, for research, is never forget that they're human institutions and they should place people above structure. That's my whole message, even, so this is second, embrace a culture of holistic. So it's a techno-scientific method. It's not just a scientific method. Not just, that's the other part. Third, you align organization funding and governance for research. This is some of the fund research to achieve meta goals. You say, like the energies and environment of whatever climate is important, but then you leave the best people to do their work. So you have a very large meta goal. The projects are much smaller, and that's different. Bell Labs always had a meta goal. There's a different meta goal and a narrow, but it's the horse Thomas Sui Gossard. The short-term goal was making a transistor. They ended up doing the fractional quantum Hall effect. We let them do it. It was not just me, it was Arno Penzias, who was not an easy boss. So this is really important, and that is the culture. And then insulate, but don't isolate research from development. You still must be aware of the next phases of it, etc. And so the culturally, however, those who are the entrepreneurs, those people who formed companies will know they're very good at forming in the new things and taking it all to the way to billions of takes to a different mindset. So you just have to be aware, but it is important because if you don't do the development part, you can't sustain the art part. Am I being clear? So third, and that was the case. People don't realize Bell Labs had 10% was research, 90% was the development organizations. The scale was different. Research was given to smaller because it's a privilege. And still, and this is not to be critical of development, it's a different purpose. And so on, don't realize it. Then block fund people, not projects. That was really important because he was not funded in a narrow way, because the way the funding was decided, Stormer and Gossard could do this without any problem. And I was only the nth executor of this because previously others had done it. That was the culture of Bell Laboratories. Third, leadership is important, not simply a matter of assembling researchers and giving them free rein. It is a matter of nurturing and orchestrating a delicate balance between organizational focus, personal development, and individual freedom. Because bad leader, and there have been bad leaders, it happened to Bell Labs as well, and has happened at universities as well, and it can make a huge, people don't realize it. Obviously, people doing the work are really important, but those who provide the funding and the leadership, etc., are very important. They set the larger goals, and then they must let, if they've hired good people, let them run within limits. So I want to end and just leave a few minutes for questions. I took this picture not about myself, but when I left Bell Labs in 1987, the Bell Labs News interviewed me, and I wrote an article on nurturing the novel neocortex, which was published by Sandia Lab News as well. I was going to Sandia. So where do you want your picture taken? I said, that's where I want my picture taken. So I went the same way, because Alexander Graham Bell is my icon. He's my guru, because of the way he was, what he cared about society, and built a great institution. It's not about me. It's really meant to say what Alexander Graham Bell said. And that's what Stormer had. In fact, American Institute of Physics included another former postdoc from Jim Eisenstein, who's very good, a collaborator of Boston, and also Buckley Prize winner. He said, Venky took me to the Alexander Graham Bell statue. And I was not the only person, others did it too, because it will tell you what the mission of the organization was. So, Sandia Lab, I want to end with that, because Jeff Saab and I organized, after I went to Kennedy School, and started teaching this intersection between science, technology, and public policy, I realized how much people had just learned Vannevar Bush, nothing else. I had my postdoc, for example, count the number of times science was mentioned and how much time technology was mentioned. If you look at the examples of Vannevar Bush cited, there are 4. there was the atom bomb. Now you could give physics more credit simply because E equal to mc squared, and the atom was important. But of course, there's a whole amount of chemical engineering which actually led to the bomb. It was not an easy road from Einstein equal to mc squared to that bomb. But at least I believe to get predicted. But the next was synthetic rubber. When I think of synthetic rubber, I think of chemical engineering. No mention of chemical engineering. Then there was a mention of what they call proximity fuse. When I think of fuse boxes, I think of electrical engineering. I don't think of physics first. Where was electrical engineering? And same with radar. So I knew there was something wrong. Even this great man had exaggerated because of how this actually worked. So and then I had a collaborator who's a very leading science and technology scholar, Sheila Jasnoff. She is sort of like the mother of that field. And she said, Venky, we've got to look at science and technology objectively. You should not come from those fields, and we, the outsiders, will tell you how it should be done. And of course, it grew my hair if I had to stand up. I said, Sheila, if we're going to collaborate, we're going to find somebody who has at least a degree in any field of science or engineering, know how they work, and also have a social science degree. I'll tell you, there are very few people like that. So we found, I insisted, and Tolu Olubusu was one of them. He was electrical engineering master's student and a PhD in social science, in all the social science. So he actually, when we did the transistor, he understood what was that. It was important. Nobody else can write the book he and I wrote because you understood how it was, or when he came and interviewed some of the people. And I did in future as well. And Jeff Sau at Sandia Lab had interest in getting that. So he and I organized a workshop and wrote articles on integrating the art and science of science and technology, where you try to bridge this union between these fields. So I think that's really going to be an ultimate thing. I think this tells you of how Bell Labs 2.0, Santa Barbara is in a sense Bell Labs 2.0. Okay, Google in a sense at the moment is Bell Labs 2.0. Google is, for me, one of the best AI companies because they did the research on DeepMind long before, 10 years before it was going to be useful. Okay, more than Microsoft. So Microsoft has the brains to buy ChatGPT. And then, of course, you have Genesis Farms, which are created, and so on. And you need funding and all these other features. But I think we're going to end into a new age. This new age is going to look at how what AI can teach us through the computing, how human intelligence and artificial intelligence can be combined to design really effective institutions. It's a very open field. It's a big conjecture, but I think it's going to be quite exciting for humanity. And we're going to have their great laboratories, both in academia and in industry. We should never destroy Google or Microsoft. I have my problems with some of them, but they know how to do this. And it is important that they be kept alive and nurtured, along with right connections to new experiments within academia and industry, etc. Because technology only survives and science only survives if you keep exploring the frontier. That's what the frontier is about. America was founded on a frontier spirit, and this is the frontier. Thank you.